Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are returning to the summer of 2009, often referred to as Dark Strike Fighter format, and taking our first deep dive look at Blackwings. Blackwings is a deck that I've seen requested in the comments really for the duration of this channel's existence, and it's a deck that's actually somewhat difficult to profile because it was competitive for such a large period of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. You could argue that Blackwings were competitive all the way from 2009 upon release, certainly through 2009, into 2010, into 2011, and maybe even into 2012, where they really started to peter off in popularity and playability. But they were competitive for a good chunk of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, even after limitations to key pieces like Gale and Black Whirlwind. Today, though, we're going to talk about Blackwings arguably at their peak, right after release during the summer of 2009, with 3 copies of Gale, 3 copies of Black Whirlwind, and access to Dark Strike Fighter, which I think is a very important detail to put into consideration when you understand how easy it is to go into level 7 synchros with this deck. Blackwings is one of those decks that, to me, is the perfect deck to teach somebody how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! And certainly teach them how to improve on their skills. And I don't want that comment to come across as insulting to the Blackwing aficionados, and particularly the players that really liked Blackwings during this time period, because to play Blackwings at their peak, something that players like Matt Petal and Philly Luna did regularly, seeing as how they either won SJC or almost won their nationals, to play it at the peak, you needed to have a good understanding of picking a game plan, and I'll talk about that in a moment, understanding sequencing, understanding card advantage, and understanding how to read back rows. Really, to play this deck at its peak, you needed to really fine-tune all of those skills, and relative to the decks at the time, we're looking at Glads, we're looking at Light Swarms, Cat Synchro, Dark decks based on Black Salvo and D Heroes, and then Blackwing. Blackwings was the deck that I think taught you those skills the best. So let's talk about that a little bit. When you play Blackwing, there are really 2 pathways to victory. You can rely on the engine itself to outgrind the opponent. It has a really good grind game with Black Whirlwind and Icarus Attack. Plus cards like Shura and Blizzard allow you to generate card advantage. So you could generate a ton of card advantage and sort of outgrind your opponent. Go back and forth, play into each other's back rows, and do that. It also taught you how to read back rows really well, because the way Blackwings worked, especially if Black Whirlwind was on the field, every normal summon Blackwing with Black Whirlwind on the field really necessitated a response from the opponent, or you got to search another Blackwing for the following turn, and then that was just going to snowball out of control. So if you summoned Shura with Black Whirlwind and it went uninterrupted, the summon resolved and you got to search Bora or Klute or whatever you wanted, your opponent doesn't have Book of Moon set, they don't have Bottomless set, they don't have Torrential set, they probably don't have Solemn Judgment, because that might be worth using Solemn Judgment on. They don't have any of those cards. They don't have MST set, and from a Yu-Gi-Oh! Player's perspective, when you're reading back rows, it's almost like you start with a checklist of every possibility, and as you gain new information about what your opponent is responding to and what they're not responding to, you can check off cards that either are or are not likely to be set. And this particular deck, because it had cards that required responses in this manner, was a deck that really let you do that. And now all of a sudden, if your opponent had a back row, you summoned Shura and they didn't respond, now all of a sudden you can say with reasonable likelihood, probably Mirror Forest, My Body is a Shield, could be a bluff, but it's definitely not any of these cards. It's not Torrential, so I can extend a little bit. They're very, very unlikely to sit on Torrential right there. You might think, okay, they want to save the Torrential for a more valuable play. Well, Shura with Black Whirlwind is going to generate card advantage, because then you're going to have to deal with the summon on the next turn. You might as well just do it now. At least, arguably, maybe 2 players on a really high level can make these bluffs with one another and save the Torrential, but most players know Bora, Whirlwind, you should probably Torrential that. That allows you now to learn how to read back rows, which is a skill that you will eventually need to develop for this time period. So, number 1, you can outgrind your opponent and learn card advantage. Number 2, you can learn how to read back rows. Number 3, this deck, as I commented on, had that card advantage element, but it also had the ability to win quickly through Dark Strike Fighter. Most Blackwing cards have that, let's say, 6 Samurai-like effect, go to even earlier Yu-Gi-Oh! Where it recognizes other copies and you can special summon it like Grandmaster of the 6 Samurai could do. Bora and Gale have that effect. So in some cases, you could swarm the field where you could go Shura, Bora, Gale, attack with all of the main phase 2 Dark Strike Fighter off of the Gale and the Bora, and now tribute off your monsters and deal enough damage to win. And when you combine those types of cards with things like Klute, which allows you to obviously generate even more damage in the battle phase, plus cards like Monster Reborn, Dark Arm Dragon, it's very easy to generate a lot of damage very quickly by swarming the field. And if you're playing this deck, you really need to assess what is more likely to result in my victory. that really aggressive aggro line where I'm relying on Dark Strike Fighter? Or do I feel like the course of the game right now, my opponent has a lot of back rows, I can't just make that overextension. I'm going to rely on Whirlwind and Icarus attack to outgrind my opponent. Which is, again, one of the reasons why I think this deck was really great for beginners, because if you wanted to win, you, one, needed to understand how to read back rows. Two, needed to understand how to really push and grind with card advantage. But three, you also needed to learn what pathway to victory was more likely to succeed, which I think is a skill that, for me personally, it took a very long time to develop that. And I think one of the reasons why, for me, whether it was at regionals or YCSs, why I may have gone 0 for 10 and then 10 for 15, is that when that flip switched and I really kind of understood in the middle of a game how to shift from one to the other, that resulted in way more victories than any other skill that you could have developed. And I think Blackwings taught you that ability, unlike the other decks at the time. There are plenty of other times in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where you could learn that, but if you just picked up the game in 2009, Blackwings was the #1 deck that I would recommend, because it's a deck that has all of those skills necessary to really succeed, which is why I think it was really good for beginners. And again, it's not because it was super easy. I don't want the Blackwing aficionados, as I said this before, to hear that comment and think I'm downplaying the skill necessary to play the deck. It's actually quite the opposite. I think it required a lot of skills in those areas to succeed with the deck, and it was a deck, though, that required those skills so much to the point that a new player could learn them by experiencing those interactions, and then over the course of this format, really develop quite considerably as a player because they harnessed those skills. So this intro is probably a little bit different than the previous ones. We're talking more philosophically about Blackwings, but nevertheless, hopefully you enjoyed that little discussion. But without further ado, we are going to take a look at Matt Petal's exact main deck from the 2009 Canadian Nationals. And I've tweaked the side deck a little bit, just because I think some of his card choices in the side deck, with some modern perspective, I'm not really sure what they were for. If you actually go back and look at his deck, he included things like Reckless Greed in the side deck that I honestly couldn't figure out the reason for. So we're going to look at his main deck, because I don't think we've looked at a Matt Petal deck before. Tweak the side deck a little bit, but take our very first look at Blackwings, and specifically Blackwings at their absolute peak. So we're going to look at Blackwings with 3 Black Whirlwinds, 3 Gales, and access to the ever-important Dark Strike Fighter. All right, we'll start with really the monster that you want to see on turn 1 going first if you open Black Whirlwind, because it's going to allow you to continually normal summon for the first basically 3 or 4 turns of the game and generate card advantage. That is Shura. Shura is also one of the monsters that threatens a large percentage of the decks in the format. If your opponent's not setting something like Gravekeeper's Spy or I guess Jujutsu Master, Shura can basically beat over everything. And even if you're attacking something like a Dekoichi, Mystic Tomato, something that's going to replace itself, you are able to generate a little advantage by tutoring out a smaller Blackwing. You're not able to tutor out Bora, but you are able to tutor out something like Kalut, and then of course go into things like Gale, and then Synchro Summon in main phase 2. So we have 3 copies of Shura. As I mentioned, if you were to open Shura with Black Whirlwind, that's really ideal, because if you're planning on playing sort of a card advantage game, you can then search a Bora the Spear and then normal summon Bora on the second turn. Obviously, you can always special summon Bora. It has that 6 Samurai effect where if you control another Blackwing, you can special summon it from your hand. However, if you are doing that card advantage game plan with Black Whirlwind, the 1800 of Shura can allow you to search a 1700 of Bora. So it's the next step down in terms of attack threshold. Bora is an important piece to the puzzle, because when combined with Sirocco, you can actually generate quite a lot of attack points, and Bora has piercing. If you're not familiar with Sirocco, what Sirocco allows you to do is basically look at all of the attack points of all the Blackwings on the field, both sides of the field as a matter of fact, put it onto one, and then that's the only monster that can attack that turn. So for example, if you go normal Bora, a normal Sirocco, special Bora, you can bump Bora up to 37, the combined 2000 and 1700, and now you have a 3700 Piercer. And if you have even more Blackwings on the field, obviously you can boost the attack of Bora pretty high. And this is a format with Dark Strike Fighter, so sometimes that piercing over an opponent who's sort of not expecting that, plus Dark Strike Fighter main phase 2 can actually win you the game. So piercing in and of itself might not feel like the most valuable effect, but when you have a card like Sirocco in your deck and the ability to boost Bora really high, plus the fact that you can boost it with Kalut, actually matters. This deck does a good job of finding ways to win. And I guess we'll just talk about Kalut next. Kalut, in terms of the chain of Black Whirlwind, is next up. So you can go summon Shura turn 1, summon Bora, normal summon specifically turn 2, and then normal summon Kalut turn 3. And I know Kalut's effect is in and of itself not useful on the field. It's really just a 1400 3-star non-tuner, but it is still going to continue to generate advantage because Kalut can then search some of the remaining monsters, the 1300 monsters that we'll talk about in just a moment. Kalut is sort of this deck's version of Honest, but it's a version of Honest that doesn't require your opponent to have a monster on the field, which means with this deck, you could declare a direct attack and then drop as many Kalutes as you wanted. So it's also an effect that stacks on top of each other. Honest didn't necessarily do that. So what you could do is you could attack with Bora and then drop multiple copies of Kalute. And now all of a sudden, even if your opponent had no monsters on the field, you're getting an additional 2,800 points of damage in. And again, it's a format with Dark Strike Fighter. This deck just wants to try and deal 1,000 damage. There is literally an endless number of ways to do that. And I already talked about the synergy with Bora. So there's that. There's also the obvious synergy with Shura. If you have Shura in attack mode, your opponent's going to be threatened by a Kalute in hand if they try to attack over it. And then obviously if your opponent attacks into Shura, you Kalute on their turn. Now all of a sudden you put let's say a Gale on your side of the field, or you search another Kalute. That's a lot of card advantage, right? Your opponent lost their monster. It's a format where there's not an infinite number of extenders. And now you have a Shura plus another monster that you just tooted out of your deck. Obviously that's pretty good. So we have 3 copies of Kalute, functions well with Bora, Shura, can just function really well in dealing a lot of damage within a direct attack. It really fits a lot of roles for this deck. Then we have 3 copies of Blackwing, Gale the Whirlwind. This card was limited to 1, but we are looking at peak-powered Blackwings with the full 3 copies of Gale. Gale is obviously an important part of the deck. It is really our primary level 3 tuner monster. The other tuner in this deck is a level 2 that we'll talk about in just a few moments. This card is especially important in a format with Dark Strike Fighter. We have 6 level 4s, so we can very often just tutor one out, whether it's through Shura's effect or through Black Whirlwind's effect, and get access to a level 4 and a level 3, which obviously makes Dark Strike Fighter. It has a pretty reasonable effect with the ability to shrink one of the opponent's monsters, if you're familiar with that. This card has been played in other decks as well, so I may have commented on that before. It also has the Bora effect, so this deck does have the ability to swarm the field. Swarming the field is really useful because you can swarm the field, make a big attack during the battle phase, and then with Bora and let's say Gale, or with Shura and Gale, you can go into Dark Strike Fighter and just shoot all of your monsters in main phase 2. Chances are you dealt a pretty reasonable amount of damage with cards like Kalute in your deck or with the piercing of Bora, and that can just end up being game. And then of course you can tutor Shura into Gale if Shura kills a monster, allowing you to go into either Dark Strike Fighter or maybe even something like Armor Master. So Gale, just an absolutely pivotal part. It has an effect where you can shrink things like Stardust Dragon. It's the tuner. It has that 6 Samurai special summon effect. It really does everything that you want. It also has less attack than Kalute, which is important, which means, let's say you're just normal summoning, turn 1 Shura into turn 2 Bora, into turn 3 Kalute, into turn 3 Gale. All of that would be free with Black Whirlwind. As of this point in time, that's where the Black Whirlwind chain ends in terms of attack points. Vayu, a very common Blackwing that you might have familiarity with, wouldn't be released until the next format, so we cannot normal summon Gale and then go into anything else, nor can we normal summon Blizzard of the Far North in normal summon anything, or to search anything out. The 13 is really the cutoff point. Blizzard is a useful piece. We're only playing 2 because it's the one that we want to see the least in our opening hand. Not that we necessarily want to see Gale or Kalute, to be completely honest with you, but at least if we have Black Whirlwind, we can tutor out this piece if we open to Kalute. And at least with Gale, we can attack over a monster once we have it. Blizzard really doesn't do anything in the opening hand. It can't be special summoned, which isn't in and of itself a big deal, but it means you can't tutor it off of Shura and you can't Blizzard a Blizzard. But it is a monster that when you normal summon, you can special summon a level 4 or lower Blackwing in defense. From that point, it is a tuner, and you can obviously go into usually a level 6, though if you were to revive a Kalute, you could go into obviously a level 5. Other things about Blizzard, this deck has the ability to play a good card advantage game plan. We talked about that Black Whirlwind idea. One of the primary ways of generating card advantage in this deck is to utilize Icarus attack, and one of the things this deck can do is summon Blizzard, special summon a Blackwing, and then if you Icarus attack, whether it's the Blizzard or the defense position Blackwing, since you can't summon Blizzard, I'm just going to put a different one, allow you now to Icarus attack either the Shura in defense or the Blizzard in attack. That monster in and of itself was a free monster that just hit the field off of Blizzard's effect, and now an Icarus attack, which is generally speaking, assuming you're not chaining it to anything, a 2 for 2, is now really a 2 for 1 in your favor because you're using a free monster that hit the field through Blizzard's effect. So there is some value there, and if this deck is planning on winning through card advantage, the Icarus attack Blizzard interaction is obviously really potent. The last monster in the deck that's a Blackwing is Sirocco. I've elected to put 2 Siroccos here. You could bump this up to 3, but really bad going first. Sirocco has an effect similar to Cyber Dragon in the sense that you can summon it if your opponent controls a monster and you don't, but it counts as your normal summon. So it has that Cyber Dragon-ish effect where if your opponent has a field and you don't, you can summon it without tribute, but it's not like you get to save your normal summon. It counts as your normal summon, which means going first, you can't actually summon it. However, it does trigger Black Whirlwind. So I made that comment going first. Shura is sort of the best turn 1 going first play with Black Whirlwind. Going second, if it goes uninterrupted, technically Sirocco is better because Sirocco can actually search into Shura, and then you can go down the chain of events that we talked about a moment ago, ending with one of the 1300 tuners. It also has that second effect that I commented on in context of Bora. It allows you to identify the attack points of the Blackwings on the field, cumulatively on both sides of the field, and channel it basically onto one Blackwing. So as I said a moment ago, if you go normal Sirocco, special summon Bora, you can boost Bora up to 37, and that can also escalate, right? You could special summon Gale, you could summon a second Bora, and you can just continually channel all the attack points onto the piercing Bora. Maybe deal enough damage in combination with Dark Strike Fighter main phase 2 to win the game. So some cool interactions there with Sirocco. Obviously has utility in the mirror match, as I commented on. I kept saying it does check the attack points of all Blackwings on the field. Some people actually cited Sirocco against this deck for that. I don't think that's the greatest thing in the world, but you know, technically if you go normal summon Sirocco against an opponent who went normal summon Shura to start the turn, and you use the effect, it's going to boost up to a 38. And now if you attack, you don't have to worry about Colute. They could have double Colute, which is obviously a catastrophe, but they can't have one Colute and actually deal with that. And this is actually a pretty reasonable out to a turn run Shura set Icarus with Colute in hand, which is otherwise really hard to deal with. So this is actually a really good way, because if you tried to deal with that with the, let's say, essentially 3200 attack, a Shura plus a Colute, you'd probably have to go into the extra deck, which would require a tuner and non-tuner on the field, and then your opponent can just Icarus you there. And if they just summon one monster, there's basically no monster that single-handedly can attack over a Shura with Colute in hand, other than Sirocco. So you would actually see people side Sirocco, which is something to definitely acknowledge. And then this deck is entirely all dark monsters, as you can see. Not only that, it's a dark deck that can actually manipulate the count of darks in the grave with a card like Blizzard, which is obviously one of the points that you really look for in a Dark Arm deck, the ability to manipulate the dark count in the grave in case you ever go over 3. So Dark Arm Dragon obviously makes a ton of sense. It enables a ton of OTKs. One of the downfalls of this deck is its weakness to Crush Card Virus. If we take out sort of the lower tuner and then Colutes, a large percentage of this deck's monsters are Crush Card targets. This deck had that weakness. It was also a dark deck that didn't really have any Crush Card targets you could reasonably play. And Crush Card was one of the most powerful cards in the format, if not one of the top 3, if not the most powerful card of the format. So it's interesting, a dark deck that can't actually play Crush Card Virus, but nevertheless, that is our monster count. In terms of our spells, we are at a point where Black Whirlwind is fully at 3, so we can play 3 copies of Black Whirlwind. Obviously, going first, you want to open as many of these as possible, assuming you actually have a Black Whirlwind to normal summon. You know, the classic Shura plus Black Whirlwind turn 1 is really difficult to deal with. And now, obviously, if you open up multiple Black Whirlwinds, that can escalate. You don't open up too many, because then you just get stuck with monsters, and you basically have to try an OTK, because you don't have a lot of defense. But you do definitely want to see one of these early on. We have a couple copies of Book of Moon. Book of Moon is a good card in this deck, because with a card like Shura, anytime you can attack over something and generate advantage, it's really good. It's also just, generally speaking, a pretty powerful card. It's a chainable. It's good in the mirror match because Black Whirlwind needs to identify the attack points after the normal summon is successful. And if the monster's face down, there's no attack points to register, so Black Whirlwind is unable to search. So it's good in the mirror match, has utility in a lot of matchups. It's just a great card. We have 2 copies of Allure of Darkness. This deck is a deck entirely of dark monsters, so Allure makes a lot of sense. If we do open those hands where we have a lot of Black Whirlwinds and now all of a sudden we have a handful of monsters, Allure of Darkness is a great way to siphon through that, find some of our protection cards. We have 1 copy of Heavy Storm and 1 copy of MST. They're basically staple at this time. Same could be said about Monster Reborn. More or less same could be said about Brain Control. You might not see this in things like Light Sworns or honestly maybe not even GBs. So I wouldn't quite put it as a staple, but any deck that has a ton of tuners is going to play Brain Control just because of how easy it is to take your opponent's monster and tune with it or to synchro with it. Same can be said about Mind Control. You could play 3 Mind Controls, which is something that you would see more in Cat Synchro decks, a deck that really wanted a lot of spells to combine with Monk. Matt Petal elected only to run 1, and I think that makes sense, right? This deck has Gale, which is the most common way of tuning with an opponent's monster, so there's that. And then one of the cards that's a little interesting that's not super common, but Matt did run it, is a copy of Dark Eruption. What Dark Eruption allows you to do is add a dark monster with 1500 or less attack from your graveyard to your hand, which basically means you can get all of the small Blackwings. I don't think this card does a good job of getting you out of the early stages of the game, which I think is one of this deck's faults. I feel like a card like Black Whirlwind makes it so that this deck, once it gets going, is hard to run out of gas. So I'm not sure in retrospect if I would recommend actually using Dark Eruption, but I think since it's a card we haven't profiled in anything else, I think it's interesting to think about. But yes, it basically gives you the 3rd Blizzard, the 4th Gale, the 4th Kalute, if you absolutely need it in the late game. So it does have some interesting utility there. It is another way of manipulating the Dark Haunt for Dark Arm, so I think that should also be mentioned. In terms of the traps, this is one of the decks that usually had a triple Solemn Judgment trap lineup. So triple Solemn Judgment was really common in Gladiator Beasts. It was common in, I'd say, about half of Cat Synchro decks. I think I prefer it in Cat Synchro decks, but it wasn't an absolute staple. And it was really common in Blackwing decks. So the triple Solemn Judgment package, a package I'm always a fan of playing. Matt elected to run the full 3 copies of Bottomless Trap Hole. I mean, this is a format where Bottomless Trap Hole is good against every deck. Maybe questionable against the Black Salvo decks. But even that deck, it has some use, something like Plasma. But against Lightsworns, it's really good. It hits Judgment Dragon, Celestia, hits Lila before they can use their effect. Obviously, it's fantastic in the mirror match because it'll get rid of things like Shura and Bora before you get to search off Black Whirlwind. Obviously, really good against Dark Arm Dragon and any deck that can summon it. Incredible against Blackwings, as I just mentioned. Really good against Gladiator Beasts. This is a format where there's only one Bestiari. Your opponent has to be very, very cautious about getting that Bestiari banished by Bottomless, because then they won't be able to go into Geyseris for the rest of the game. So it's a really, really valuable card in the sense that it hits every single deck. So it's a card that Matt elected to play 3 of. Then we have 2 copies of Icarus Attack. This was one of the points of discussion, which was how many Icarus Attacks are we actually going to play? Are we going to play a full 3 copies? Are we going to play 2 copies? It was really a point of significant discussion for a lot of players. Matt elected only to go with 2 copies of Icarus Attack. And I think one of the concessions for this deck potentially struggling early on is the idea of opening a hand where you have Icarus Attack without actually having a Blackwing. Now, on the other hand, though, Icarus Attack, if played properly, is one of those cards that can really shift the game in your favor. So there is some discussion about maybe potentially playing the 3rd. In a perfect world, Icarus Attack is actually generating a +1. What you really want to do is use Icarus Attack in response to your opponent's Bottomless or Book of Moon or Torrential Tribute, Mirror Force, cards like that, where in addition to sacrificing, obviously, the Blackwing and the Icarus Attack, and assuming you're just going 2 for 2, you're also getting rid of a card that your opponent has activated, which means you're really dealing with 3 of their cards. So, for example, if your opponent has a monster and 2 set back rows, and you go summon Shura and they Bottomless, the Bottomless, all right, so we already sort of dealt with that. That's going to leave the field at the end of this chain. But if I go chain Icarus, tribute my Shura that was going to get banished anyway with Bottomless, and kill your other back row and monster, now I'm trading Icarus and Shura for 3 cards on your side of the field. Your Bottomless plus your set plus your monster. That's really the interaction that you're trying to do. And this deck can win through a Dark Strike Fighter really quick, Swarm the Field game plan. This deck can go card advantage where you're going through the Black Whirlwind iteration and you're tributing off monsters special summoned by Blizzard, and then using Icarus Attack and then sort of whittling away your opponent's resources. It has that flexibility to go in both directions, which is a reason why I think this deck saw a lot of play. And Icarus Attack is one of the best ways of shifting the game in your favor. I also think this card is particularly good against some of the back row heavy decks if you can use it during the end phase. Obviously, in a format where back row decks are playing Solemn Judgment, there is a little bit of an issue there. And Icarus Attack, I actually think, had a little bit of an issue against a deck like Lightsworns. If your opponent sort of played the game properly and could just summon Judgment Dragon, reading Icarus Attack as your back row, it's going to put you in a weird position where you end up hoping that there's enough cards on the field for you to Icarus Attack and kill their Judgment Dragon and a card on your side of the field. Your opponent's probably going to just go priority, but it doesn't really cleanly deal with Judgment Dragon. It basically turns Judgment Dragon into a Black Rose effect, which can still be advantageous to your opponent. So Icarus Attack is one of the most powerful cards. It has a lot of utility, did a good job fighting against your opponent's Black Whirlwinds, did a good job dealing your opponent's Blackwings when Black Whirlwind was on the field. I mean, it really did a lot of things. But playing 3 copies to some was considered overkill, and cutting down to 2 is sort of a consistency decision that Matt made. So only 2 copies of Icarus Attack, even though it's arguably one of the most powerful cards in this deck. And then we have sort of the basic 2 mass trap cards that almost every deck minus Lightsworn played, the mass removal cards of Mirror Force and Torrential. But that is our trap lineup. 3 Solemn, 3 Bottomless, double Icarus, Torrential, and Mirror Force. Next, we'll go into the extra deck, as we typically do. and then we'll talk a little bit about the decks that you could anticipate playing against in this format and the side deck. So this deck needs, I'm going to call them the Mind Control, Brain Control, and Monster Reborn targets. A lot of decks, even if they weren't Glad decks, played Gyarados because with Monster Reborn, Mind Control, and Brain Control, you could theoretically actually get 2 Blackwings on the field, so Gyarados is really valuable. This deck, even in the side deck, at least of the version that I'm about to profile, does not have a level 4 non-tuner spellcaster, but you have Mind Control, and you have Gale. You could very easily Mind Control Spy, which was incredibly common, right? Cat Synchro played Spy. You could take it, go into Arcanite Magician. Arcanite's effect is so powerful, we think it was warranted to have that in there. So those are the 2 that we're not going to go into unless we steal an opponent's monster. Everything else we can actually access. So for level 5s, you have Giorlando and Magical Android. This deck can actually trigger Giorlando's effect because everything's low level, at least the tuners are. So if you synchro multiple times in a turn, you actually could boost this. For the level 7, actually go to level 6s, we have Goyo Guardian, and then we have Armored Wing. The lack of Gaia in cards like that is because this deck's really only going to go into level 6s when we go Gale plus Kalut and then Blizzard plus a guy from the graveyard, a level 4 from the graveyard, which is obviously common, but we don't need a ton of level 6s at that point. Goyo is obviously the best one, and then we have sort of the Blackwing specific one. That was more than enough. This deck, in terms of the extra deck, wants more space for the level 7s because Gale plus Boro or Shura is a much more common actual pathway to victory. The level 6s are fine, you need them, but they're not necessarily win conditions. In terms of level 7s, we have obviously 2 copies of Dark Strike Fighter. This is Dark Strike format. This deck has the ability to go into Dark Strike all the time. Main phase 2 Dark Strike is a huge win condition, so we absolutely need 2 copies there. We need 1 copy of Black Rose Dragon. Obviously, if we're talking about a level 7 base synchro deck, we need that. Technically, you want 2 copies of Armor Master. I only have 1 copy here, but 2 copies of Armor Master is what was basically the standard. So it was basically 2 of these and 1 of these in terms of the Blackwing count. Then we have the level 8s. We have Red Dragon Archfiend, Stardust Dragon, Colossal, and Thought Ruler. Basically the standard 4 original, very good synchro monsters that came out in the Duelist Genesis. In terms of how you actually summon these, you can actually go into Sirocco, which is a level 5, and then special summon Gale. That was your primary way of actually going into these, not considering sort of unusual ways with Mind Control, Brain Control, and Reborn. But you could actually go normal summon Sirocco, search Gale off Black Whirlwind, special summon Gale, half your opponent's monster, go into one of these. And a card like Stardust is obviously really good if you're playing a bunch of traps. So it did give this deck the flexibility of going into the level 8s, even though we haven't commented on them before. So 8, 7, 6s, all really common. Even 5s are pretty common. You want to be able to go Blizzard plus Kalut into a level 5. So access to a wide array of levels from the extra deck. In terms of what decks you could anticipate playing in. So we've looked at the Dark Strike format quite a few times recently, so I will briefly go through them just to reiterate that we could run into Gladiator Beasts, we could run into Lightsworns, we could run into Cat Synchro, there was the Black Salvo deck that we talked about recently, and then there was, of course, the Mirror Match, which I'll represent with a Icarus attack, and I'll steal something from the deck. So that is really the top 4 decks at the time. We've talked about a few of them recently. Most recently, Black Salvo, definitely Cat Synchro recently, but these are really the top 4 decks. So what are we going to do? So I have a combination of cards here that were reflective, a little bit of Matt Petal's side deck from the 2010 Canadian Nationals, but also some ideas from other players as well. Sorry, the 2009 Canadian Nationals, and then a few other players as well. So we have 2 copies of Legendary Jiu-Jitsu Master. This gave you a side deck option against Gladiator Beasts. My issue with Jiu-Jitsu Master, although it was pretty common, is that this deck's Glad matchup is actually pretty good. If you remember when I talked about Gladiator Beast decks and then specifically played a Gladiator Beast mirror match, I talked about the attack threshold, meaning unless your opponent's doing something with, at this time, even Rescue Cat, but Cold Wave, Prisma, Test Tiger, if your opponent's just playing Gladiator Beast, I'm going to call it fairly, trying to attack over monsters, trying to attack directly, that doesn't line up very well against a deck that has high attack counts, because if you look at the bulk of Blackwing monsters, especially the ones that you're willing to normal summon and leave just face up on the field for a turn, you have attacks of 2018 and 17, which means Laquari, the highest attack threshold normal summon Gladiator Beast, can at best attack over Bora and then only crash into Shura and then obviously do nothing against Sirocco. And then when you add Clue to this, making it so that every Blackwing can get over that threshold, it makes it really awkward because if you don't have a Laquari, then you have Darius as sort of the next tier down, and Darius at best only crashes with Bora, which means Gladiator Beasts can't really generate the type of game plan that they want and really generate the card advantage the way they want, unless they're doing some of the more unfair things that their deck has access to. So historically, Blackwings has been a pretty good matchup against Glads, because as long as you keep them from Cold Waving and keep them from using Rescue Cat into Sam Knight and keep them from Prisma Test Tiger, if you just try and play engine versus engine in a very straight up, let's pass back and forth and play a grind game, Blackwings is almost always going to win because of the attack threshold. It's really, really hard to actually get an attack to go through and then tag out a Gladiator Beast against Blackwing. So although it was somewhat common to see Jiu-Jitsu Masters, I don't necessarily think that that was overwhelmingly necessary, but we have a couple here nevertheless. We have the third copy of Sirocco. It's really good in the mirror match, so I can understand having it. A lot of players put the third copy of Sirocco because of the perception that it was so good in the mirror, and I actually even commented on that interaction while doing the video against an opponent who summoned Sirocco, summoned Shura on turn 1. One card that I saw here or there was a copy of My Body's a Shield. I liked My Body's a Shield in this format. It was a way of playing into back rows where you had protection, but then also protecting you against things like Icarus Attack, Judgment Dragon, Celestia, Geyseris. Had a really cool utility in this format. A lot of really cool interactions where My Body was pretty good. Then comes the traps, and the traps are interesting. So Matt elected to play Skill Drain. So that's definitely an option. This deck has just a lot of big monsters, and you don't necessarily need their effects. You could just theoretically rely on their big attack threshold and maybe outgrind your opponent with your card advantage engines, which is what Icarus Attack and Black Rowan allow you to do. Some players were a little bit more specific and just played Light and Prisoning Mirror. You really wouldn't play both of them, so you'd really select one of the two. I think you could probably just play Light and Prisoning Mirror, though I understand playing Skill Drain. Honestly, there's a pretty good debate here, but I think you should have one of these because Lightsworns are so powerful that I really wanted one of these type of effects. Then a card that got a little popular toward the end, and it was actually at 3 at the format. Some people did elect to main deck this, but it wasn't as popular as you might think, which is Royal Oppression, which might seem like an odd card to side deck because it is a card that we've seen in a lot of main decks, but it wasn't universally in the main deck. That's why I elected not to include it, and Matt didn't include it in his main deck. But I definitely want to acknowledge that it's not uncommon to put Oppression in the side deck. The next card that I saw in a lot of side decks was Threatening Roar. We talked about Threatening Roar when we went over the Black Salvo, Dark Arm, D-Hero deck. In a format with Cold Wave into Synchro Cat combos, obviously you want to have cards like Threatening Roar, chainables that basically keep you alive. Another thing about Skill Drain to comment on is if your opponent does the Cold Wave play, you can actually flip Skill Drain and they can't use any of their effects. So if you did decide to go with Skill Drain, you could also side deck it against a Cat Synchro player who's using Cold Wave, which isn't a guarantee. Not everybody used Cold Wave. A lot of people think about Cat Synchro as Cat plus Cold Wave or Monk plus Cold Wave, but Cold Wave wasn't even necessarily a staple in those decks. But if you saw Cold Wave in their deck, you could side in the Skill Drain because it's just an absolute blowout. They might just Cold Wave you for nothing and pass. And then some one-ofs. This deck, at least Matt's version, wasn't main decking Trap Dust Shoot. A lot of players did. Philly Luna won the last Shonen Jump of this format at Gen Con in Indianapolis and main deck Trap Dust Shoot. So it's a format with Heavy Storm. Anytime that Heavy Storm is legal, people aren't just setting all of their spell and trap cards. It makes sense then to consider playing Dust Shoot because then it's still good going second. Your opponent's not just going to get down to one card in hand. So Trap Dust Shoot, I think it's really good in this format too because you can chain it to Cold Wave, chain it to Trunade, chain it to some of the Cat Synchro back row clearing plays. Same is true with Mind Crush. So I elected to put these two. One card that a little bit debatable, but it's Delta Reverse or Delta Crow Anti-Reverse. What this card does is it lets you destroy all your opponent's set spell and trap cards if you control a Blackwing. And technically, if you control 3, you can just activate this from your hand, but that's not overwhelmingly common. It's a pretty good card going first against the back row decks. It's basically another version of Icarus Attack, which a lot of people actually side deck the third copy too, so I will put that here as a consideration. It's basically another copy of Icarus Attack that you can use going first, but not have to tribute the Blackwing. So if your opponent's playing Gladiator Beasts and they see that you summon Sure, and they're like, okay, well, I can't just summon a Glad. I don't have any Glad strong enough to deal with that, so I'm just going to set 3 back rows and hopefully play a slow game. And you just go end phase Delta Crow, and you pop all their back rows. Obviously, you're going to win that game. So it had some utility there, which is a card that you saw in some people's side decks. It's a sort of a theme-specific back row removal card that Blackwings had access to. But nevertheless, that's Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History, taking a deep dive look at Blackwings for the very first time. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.